Picture this, it's 1860, and the United States is like a house divided against itself. Half the rooms are decorated one way, half another, and the family living inside can't agree on the most basic rules. This isn't just any disagreement. It's the kind that tears families apart, sends neighbours to opposite sides of battle lines, and reshapes a nation forever. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was more than just a military conflict. It was a reckoning with the fundamental question of what America would become. Would it remain a collection of loosely connected states, each free to chart its own course, or would it emerge as a unified nation bound by common principles and shared destiny? This story unfolds like a slow-burning drama, with characters both heroic and flawed, decisions both brilliant and tragic, and consequences that ripple through generations. It's a tale worth telling in full, from the seeds of division planted decades before the first shot was fired, to the long aftermath that still echoes in American society today. As we journey through this defining chapter of American history, we'll explore not just the battles and the politics, but the human stories that made this conflict so profoundly personal. From the slave quarters of southern plantations to the factory floors of northern cities, from the halls of Congress to the muddy trenches of Gettysburg, this is the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Division. The roots of the Civil War stretch back to the very founding of the United States, embedded in the contradictions of a nation that proclaimed all men were created equal while simultaneously allowing millions to live in bondage. The Constitution, that marvel of political compromise, had papered over these contradictions rather than resolving them. From the beginning, the North and South developed along different paths. The North, with its rocky soil and harsh winters, turned to commerce, manufacturing, and small-scale farming. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became centers of trade and industry. The South, blessed with fertile soil and a warm climate, built its economy on large-scale agriculture, tobacco, rice, and especially cotton. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 changed everything. Suddenly, cotton production became incredibly profitable, and the demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed. By 1860, the South was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton, and the profits were enormous. As one southern planter wrote, "Cotton is king, and the African must be his subject." But this prosperity came at a horrific human cost. By 1860, nearly 4 million people lived in bondage across the South. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were mothers separated from children, fathers sold away from families, human beings reduced to property. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality had become impossible to ignore. The political system struggled to contain these tensions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had maintained a delicate balance between slave and free states, but each new territory added to the Union threatened to upset this equilibrium. The Compromise of 1850 tried to paper over the cracks again, but it only delayed the inevitable confrontation. In Kansas, the tensions exploded into violence in the 1850s. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the territory, each side determined to tip the balance their way. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the larger conflict to come. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was another spark, terrifying the South with the spectre of armed slave rebellion. Meanwhile, a new political party was rising in the North. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. They didn't necessarily want to abolish slavery where it existed, but they were determined to prevent its spread. Their nominee in 1860 was a tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's election was the final straw for many Southerners. Here was a man who had declared that a house divided against itself cannot stand, who believed that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Even though Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery where it existed, his election represented an existential threat to the Southern way of life. The die was cast. The long-brewing tensions between North and South, between freedom and slavery, between two incompatible visions of America's future, were about to explode into the bloodiest conflict in American history. Chapter 2. The Point of No Return. The news of Lincoln's election victory reached Charleston, South Carolina, on November 7, 1860, and the city erupted in celebration, not for Lincoln, but for what his election meant. Church bells rang, crowds gathered in the streets, and everyone seemed to understand that this was the moment they had been waiting for. South Carolina had finally found its excuse to leave the Union. The election results told the story of a nation divided. Lincoln had won with less than 40% of the popular vote, but he had swept the North and West, winning 180 electoral votes to his nearest competitor's 72. More tellingly, Lincoln's name hadn't even appeared on the ballot in 10 southern states. The American political system had split along geographical lines. South Carolina wasted no time. On December 20th, 1860, a special convention in Charleston voted unanimously to secede from the Union. The delegates signed the Ordinance of Secession with golden pens, and the crowd outside cheered as if they were celebrating Independence Day. In their declaration, they made their reasoning clear. The union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is hereby dissolved. But South Carolina didn't want to go it alone. Within 6 weeks, 6 more states had followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, representatives from these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America. The speed of secession surprised many in the North. Some had assumed it was all bluster, that cooler heads would prevail. But the South was deadly serious. They elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as their provisional president. Davis was a West Point graduate, a Mexican War veteran, and a skilled politician, everything the new Confederacy needed in a leader. Meanwhile, in Washington, the lame duck President James Buchanan seemed paralyzed by the crisis. Buchanan believed that while states didn't have the right to secede, the federal government had no power to stop them. It was a constitutional catch-22 that left the Union rudderless during its greatest crisis. Lincoln wouldn't take office until March 4, 1861, but he was already trying to navigate the crisis. In his inaugural address, he struck a tone that was both conciliatory and firm. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But he also made clear that he would not recognize secession. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. The flashpoint came at Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor. The fort's commander, Major Robert Anderson, found himself in an impossible position. He had fewer than 100 men, dwindling supplies, and was surrounded by Confederate forces. The Confederate government demanded the fort's surrender, but Anderson refused. Lincoln faced his first major decision as president. Should he resupply the fort and risk war, or should he abandon it and appear weak? He chose a middle path, announcing that he would send supplies but not reinforcements. The Confederate government saw this as an act of aggression. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, with over 3,000 shells fired at the fort. Remarkably, no one was killed during the bombardment, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The Civil War had begun. The attack on Fort Sumter galvanized the North. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and the response was overwhelming. In Massachusetts, so many men volunteered that the state couldn't equip them all. But Lincoln's call for troops also pushed 4 more states into the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The war that many predicted would last a few months was about to become a 4-year nightmare that would claim more American lives than all other wars combined. The point of no return had been reached, and there was no going back. Chapter 3: A Nation Prepares for War. In the spring of 1861, as the reality of war set in, both sides began the massive task of preparing for what they still believed would be a short, decisive conflict. The contrast between North and South was stark, and yet both sides were confident in their ability to achieve quick victory. The North held overwhelming advantages in almost every measurable category, with 22 million people compared to the South's 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were enslaved. The Union had more than twice the manpower. The North produced 97% of the nation's firearms, 94% of its cloth, 93% of its pig iron, and over 90% of its boots and shoes. The Union had 22,000 miles of railroad track compared to the Confederacy's 9,000 miles, and most of the nation's telegraph lines ran through Northern territory. But the South had advantages too, though they were harder to quantify. Southern men had a strong military tradition. Many of the nation's best officers were Southerners, and the region had produced more than its share of military leaders. The South was also fighting a defensive war on familiar territory, which historically had been an advantage. As Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston noted, we had only to resist, while our enemies had to conquer. Perhaps most importantly, the South had cotton. Cotton is king, declared Senator James Hammond of South Carolina, and many believed that European dependence on southern cotton would force Britain and France to recognize Confederate independence. This king cotton diplomacy was a cornerstone of Confederate strategy. The military preparations revealed the amateur nature of both armies. The US Army in 1861 had only 16,000 men, most of them scattered in small frontier posts. Both sides would have to build their armies from scratch, and both faced the same challenges: finding competent officers, training raw recruits, and equipping massive forces. The volunteer system initially favoured the South. Southern men seemed more enthusiastic about the war, and many had military experience or at least familiarity with firearms. Companies formed around local communities with colourful names like the Raccoon Roughs and the Chickahominy Greys. These volunteer units elected their own officers, often choosing the most popular rather than the most competent. The North's volunteers were equally enthusiastic, but perhaps less prepared. The 7th New York Regiment, known as the Silk Stocking Regiment because of its wealthy membership, marched to war with a regimental library and French chefs. Other northern units brought their own bands and elaborate uniforms. The war still seemed like it might be more pageant than bloodbath. Both sides faced the challenge of turning civilians into soldiers. The typical Civil War soldier was a young man in his 20s, probably a farmer or a labourer, with little education and no military experience. Training was often haphazard. Many soldiers went into battle having fired their weapons only a few times, if at all. The officer corps was equally improvised. West Point had produced only about 1,000 graduates by 1861, and many of these experienced officers had to choose sides. Robert E. Lee, offered command of Union forces, famously resigned from the US Army rather than fight against his native Virginia. His decision symbolized the painful choices facing military families across the nation. Lincoln's biggest challenge was finding competent generals. The elderly Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican War, was too frail for field command. The president would go through a series of commanders, each one promising to end the war quickly, each one failing to deliver. The Confederacy seemed to have an advantage in military leadership. Jefferson Davis was a West Point graduate and former Secretary of War. Generals like Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart would prove to be among the war's most capable commanders. But the Confederacy faced its own challenges in building an effective government and military structure from scratch. As summer approached, both sides were eager for battle. The northern press cried on to Richmond, while southern newspapers predicted that one good battle would send the Yankees running home. The stage was set for the war's first major confrontation, and both armies were about to learn that this conflict would be unlike anything they had imagined. Chapter 4: First Blood and Hard Lessons. The first major battle of the Civil War came on July 21, 1861, at a small stream called Bull Run, about 30 miles southwest of Washington. It was a hot summer day, and the battle drew an unusual audience. Congressmen, reporters, and Washington society ladies who had driven out in carriages to watch what they expected to be a brief, decisive engagement. The Union Army, commanded by General Irvin McDowell, numbered about 35,000 men, the largest force ever assembled on American soil. The Confederate Army, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, was slightly smaller but well positioned along Bull Run. Neither commander had experience managing such large forces, and both armies were filled with green troops who had never seen combat. The battle began well for the Union. McDowell's forces crossed Bull Run and seemed to be rolling up the Confederate left flank. But the tide turned when Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad. The first time in history that rail transport had been used to move troops to a battle. Among these reinforcements was a brigade commanded by Thomas J. Jackson, who earned his nickname Stonewall when a fellow officer shouted, "There is Jackson, standing like a stone wall!" By afternoon, the Union attack had stalled, and a Confederate counterattack turned the northern retreat into a rout. Soldiers threw away their equipment and ran for Washington, mixing with the terrified spectators who had come to watch the battle. The Confederate victory was complete, but they were too disorganized to pursue and possibly capture Washington. Bull Run taught both sides hard lessons. This would not be a short war, and it would not be bloodless. The romantic notions of war that had prevailed in the spring gave way to a grimmer reality. As one Union soldier wrote home, "We went out to fight men and came back whipped by boys." The defeat at Bull Run led to major changes in Union leadership. Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan, a young West Point graduate who had shown promise in early operations in Western Virginia. McClellan was a superb organizer and trainer, and he set about building what he called the Army of the Potomac into a professional fighting force. McClellan's training methods were thorough and effective. He insisted on proper drill, discipline, and equipment. He built a strong staff system and established clear chains of command. The soldiers loved him. They called him Little Mac and cheered wildly whenever he appeared. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was extremely cautious and consistently overestimated enemy strength. While McClellan trained his army, the war was expanding beyond anyone's initial expectations. In Missouri, a vicious guerrilla war had erupted between Confederate sympathizers and Union loyalists. In Kentucky, both sides maneuvered for control of this crucial border state. Along the coast, Union naval forces were establishing a blockade of southern ports. The naval war was particularly important because it represented the Union's attempt to strangle the Confederacy economically. The Anaconda Plan, proposed by General Winfield Scott, called for a naval blockade to cut off southern exports and imports, while Union forces advanced down the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two. The blockade was initially ineffective. The US Navy had only 42 ships to patrol 3,500 miles of coastline, but it would gradually tighten as the Union built more ships and captured more Confederate ports. By 1865, the blockade would be one of the war's decisive factors. The war took a dramatic turn with the emergence of ironclad warships. The CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack, was a Confederate experiment in armored warfare. On March 8, 1862, the Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads and destroyed two Union wooden warships, the Cumberland and the Congress. It seemed like the Virginia might be able to break the Union blockade single-handedly. But the Union had its own ironclad, the USS Monitor, which arrived at Hampton Roads the next day. The battle between the Monitor and the Virginia on March 9, 1862, was the first engagement between armoured warships. The two vessels pounded each other for hours without decisive result, but the age of wooden warships was over. In the Western theatre, the war was developing differently. Here, Union forces had more success, largely due to the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was an unlikely hero, a failed businessman and former alcoholic who had resigned from the army in disgrace. But he understood war in a way that many of his contemporaries did not. Grant's breakthrough came in February 1862 with the capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. These victories opened the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers to Union forces and forced the Confederacy to abandon much of Tennessee. When the Confederate commander at Fort Donelson asked for terms, Grant replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." The press seized on this phrase, and Grant became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. The success in the West stood in stark contrast to the stalemate in the East. Throughout 1862, McClellan's Army of the Potomac remained largely inactive, much to Lincoln's frustration. The president reportedly said, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." Meanwhile, the war was changing in ways that few had anticipated. What had begun as a limited conflict to preserve the Union was becoming a total war that would transform American society. The issue of slavery, which politicians had tried to keep out of the conflict, was forcing its way to the center of the war's meaning. As 1862 progressed, it became clear that this would be a long, bloody struggle that would test the very foundations of American democracy. The easy victories that both sides had expected were nowhere to be found, and the war was just beginning to reveal its true character. Chapter 5. The War Deepens. By 1862, the Civil War had lost any pretense of being a limited conflict. What had begun as a political dispute about the nature of the Union had evolved into a total war that would reshape American society. Both sides were learning that winning would require not just military victory, but the complete transformation of their enemy's ability to fight. The Union's Peninsula Campaign of 1862 exemplified both the promise and the frustration of Northern war efforts. General McClellan finally moved his massive Army of the Potomac, landing at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula and advancing slowly toward Richmond. On paper, the plan was sound. McClellan could use Union naval superiority to supply his forces while avoiding the strong Confederate defenses around Washington. But McClellan's excessive caution turned what should have been a quick strike into a grinding siege. He spent a month besieging Yorktown, held by fewer than 15,000 Confederate troops, when he could have overwhelmed the position in a day. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston later admitted that McClellan could have walked into Richmond with little resistance if he had moved quickly. The campaign reached its climax in the 7 days' battles, June 25 to July 1, 1862, when Robert E. Lee took command of Confederate forces defending Richmond. Lee's aggressive tactics caught McClellan off guard in 7 days of fighting. Lee launched a series of attacks that pushed McClellan's army back toward the James River. The Union forces weren't defeated, they inflicted more casualties than they received, but McClellan's nerve was broken. The Peninsula Campaign's failure revealed a fundamental problem with Union strategy. Northern generals seemed to believe that capturing territory would end the war, but the Confederacy could trade space for time. As long as Southern armies remained intact, the war would continue. Lincoln was learning this lesson too, and it was changing his approach to the conflict. The president had initially insisted that the war was about preserving the Union, not about slavery. But by 1862, he was beginning to understand that slavery was both the cause of the war and the source of Confederate strength. Enslaved people produced the food that fed Confederate armies and the cotton that the South hoped would bring European recognition. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on September 22, 1862, marked a turning point in the war's meaning. Lincoln announced that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in states still in rebellion would be forever free. The proclamation was limited. It didn't apply to slaveholding areas under Union control, but it fundamentally changed the war's character. The timing was crucial. Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, which had given the Union a much-needed victory. Without this success, the proclamation might have seemed like the desperate act of a losing cause. Instead, it appeared to be the confident declaration of a nation with the moral high ground. The proclamation had immediate effects. European powers, particularly Britain and France, had been considering recognizing Confederate independence, but the Emancipation Proclamation made the war explicitly about slavery, and European public opinion would not support a slave-holding nation against one committed to freedom. The war was also becoming more brutal. The Battle of Shiloh, April 6 to 7, 1862 in Tennessee, shocked both sides with its carnage. General Grant's forces were surprised by a Confederate attack that nearly drove them into the Tennessee River. Only the arrival of reinforcements and Grant's determination to counterattack turned the tide. The battle claimed 23,000 casualties, more than all previous American wars combined. Shiloh taught both sides that this war would be unlike any previous conflict. The scale of violence was unprecedented, and the old rules of warfare seemed inadequate. As one Confederate officer wrote, "It was a picture of war in its most horrible aspect." The increased brutality was partly due to changes in military technology. The rifled musket, which most Civil War soldiers carried, was accurate at much longer ranges than the smoothbore muskets of earlier wars. But military tactics hadn't adapted to this new reality. Generals still ordered frontal assaults against entrenched positions, with predictably bloody results. The war was also becoming more destructive to civilian society. Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley were beginning to target Southern infrastructure and resources. General John Pope issued orders for his troops to live off the land and to treat Confederate civilians as enemies. This was a preview of the hard war that would characterize the conflict's later years. Confederate strategy was evolving too. Unable to match Union resources, Southern leaders looked for ways to take the war to Northern territory. Lee's invasion of Maryland in September 1862 was designed to shift the war's focus, potentially bringing European recognition and Northern war weariness. The Maryland campaign reached its climax at the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history. Lee's army, already weakened by hard campaigning, faced McClellan's much larger force near the town of Sharpsburg. The battle was a series of uncoordinated Union attacks that Lee's forces barely managed to repel. Antietam was technically a Union victory. Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia, but it was a costly one. The Union suffered 12,400 casualties, the Confederacy 10,700. McClellan had missed a chance to destroy Lee's army, much to Lincoln's frustration. The president reportedly said, "He is an admirable engineer, but he seems to have a special talent for a stationary engine." As 1862 ended, Both sides were learning that this war would test their societies in ways they had never imagined. The romantic notions of quick, glorious victory had given way to a grimmer understanding of what lay ahead. The war was becoming a contest of wills, resources, and endurance. The question was no longer who would win the first battle, but who could sustain the longest fight. Chapter 6. The Turning Tide. The year 1863 began with a Union army demoralized by defeat and a Confederate force riding high on a string of victories. Yet by year's end, the tide of war had turned decisively in the Union's favor. 3 key events: the Battle of Gettysburg, the Siege of Vicksburg, and the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation would transform the conflict's trajectory. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863, and its impact was immediate and profound. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American orator and abolitionist, called it the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the thraldom of ages. For the first time in American history, the federal government had committed itself to ending slavery. The proclamation transformed the war from a political dispute into a moral crusade. Union soldiers now fought not just to preserve the Union, but to end human bondage. This gave the war a higher purpose that would sustain Northern morale through the dark days ahead. As one Union soldier wrote to his family, "We are fighting for something bigger than ourselves now." The military impact was equally significant. The proclamation authorized the enlistment of African American soldiers in Union forces, adding crucial manpower to the Northern war effort. By war's end, nearly 200,000 African American men would serve in Union armies and navies, comprising about 10% of total Union forces. The bravery of these soldiers helped change Northern attitudes about race and equality. The assault on Fort Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment in July 1863 became legendary. Though the attack failed, the courage of the African American soldiers impressed even skeptical whites. As one white officer wrote, "They have settled the question forever about the fighting qualities of the colored race." But the year's most decisive events were still to come. In the spring of 1863, Robert E. Lee achieved perhaps his greatest victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1-6, 1863. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Lee's brilliant tactics and the incompetence of Union General Joseph Hooker led to a stunning Confederate victory. But the triumph came at a terrible cost. Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded by friendly fire, depriving Lee of his most trusted lieutenant. Jackson's death was a devastating blow to Confederate morale. Lee reportedly said, "I have lost my right arm, but the victory at Chancellorsville convinced Lee that he could win the war with one more successful invasion of the North. If he could win a decisive battle on Northern soil, he might force Lincoln to negotiate peace." Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania in June 1863 was his boldest gamble. The Army of Northern Virginia, about 75,000 strong, crossed the Potomac and advanced deep into Pennsylvania. The invasion created panic in the North. People in Philadelphia and Baltimore prepared to evacuate as Confederate forces approached. The two armies collided at the small town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. What began as a chance encounter between advance units quickly escalated into the largest battle ever fought in North America. Over 3 days, more than 160,000 soldiers would fight for control of the strategic crossroads town. The first day went badly for the Union. Confederate forces drove Union troops through the town and onto the hills south of Gettysburg. But the Union forces managed to hold the high ground, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Little Round Top, forming a defensive line that looked like a fishhook. The second day saw desperate fighting as Lee tried to break the Union line. The battle for Little Round Top became legendary, with the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, making a bayonet charge that saved the Union left flank. As Chamberlain later wrote, the word was enough. It ran like fire along the line. The third day brought Lee's greatest gamble. Convinced that the Union centre was weak, he ordered a massive frontal assault across open ground. Pickett's charge, named after one of the Confederate division commanders, was a magnificent failure. Of the 12,500 men who began the assault, fewer than half returned. The Confederate army was shattered. Gettysburg was a turning point. Lee's invasion had failed and his army limped back to Virginia with 28,000 casualties, more than a third of his force. The Union had suffered 23,000 casualties, but had won a crucial victory. As one Confederate officer wrote, the spell of invincibility was broken, but Gettysburg was only half the story. While Lee and General George Meade fought in Pennsylvania, another decisive battle was unfolding in Mississippi. General Ulysses S. Grant had been besieging Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River since May 1863. Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and its capture would split the Confederacy in two. The city sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, and its guns controlled river traffic. But Grant's army had surrounded the city, and the siege was slowly strangling the defenders. The siege of Vicksburg became a test of endurance. Confederate General John C. Pemberton had about 30,000 men trapped in the city, while Grant's forces grew to over 70,000. The civilians of Vicksburg lived in caves to escape the constant bombardment, and food became so scarce that people ate rats and mules. After 47 days of siege, Pemberton surrendered on July 4th, 1863. The same day, Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg. The surrender of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. As Lincoln said, the Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Lee's army was no longer invincible, and the South was being slowly strangled by Union pressure. The war was far from over, but the initiative had passed to the Union. The year 1863 also saw important changes in Union leadership. Lincoln had finally found a general who understood how to fight this war. Grant's success at Vicksburg marked him as a commander who could match Lee's tactical brilliance with strategic vision and relentless determination. As 1863 ended, the Confederate cause was in serious trouble. The Union blockade was tightening, Southern resources were dwindling, and the Emancipation Proclamation had made foreign intervention impossible. The war would continue for almost 2 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Chapter 7. The Grinding Years. The year 1864 opened with the Union holding clear advantages in manpower, resources and momentum, but the Confederacy was far from defeated. What followed would be the war's bloodiest and most decisive phase, as Union forces under new leadership pursued a strategy of total war designed to break not just Confederate armies, but the South's will to continue fighting. Lincoln's promotion of Ulysses S. Grant to General-in-Chief in March 1864 marked a fundamental shift in Union strategy. Grant understood that the war could only be won by destroying Confederate armies, not just capturing territory. As he told Lincoln, the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving. Grant's plan was elegantly simple, coordinated pressure on all fronts to prevent Confederate forces from reinforcing each other. While Grant himself would accompany the Army of the Potomac against Lee in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman would advance from Tennessee toward Atlanta, and other Union forces would apply pressure throughout the South. The campaign began in May 1864 with Grant's advance into the wilderness, a tangled forest in northern Virginia where visibility was limited and cavalry was useless. The resulting battle was a confused, brutal affair fought in dense woods, where men sometimes shot their own comrades by. Mistake fires started by musket flashes burned wounded soldiers alive, and the screams of the dying filled the smoky air. The wilderness was technically a Confederate victory. Lee's forces inflicted heavy casualties on Grant's army, but unlike previous Union commanders who had retreated after such losses, Grant pressed forward. As he told his staff, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The message was clear: this would be a war of attrition, and Grant was willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve victory. The Army of the Potomac cheered when they realized they were moving south, not north. For the first time, they had a commander who wouldn't retreat after the first setback. The next 6 weeks saw some of the war's most intense fighting. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the armies fought for 2 weeks in a series of bloody engagements. The most horrific fighting occurred at the Bloody Angle, where Union forces briefly broke Confederate lines in hand-to-hand combat so intense that a 22-inch oak tree was cut down by rifle fire. The casualties were staggering. In 1 month, Grant's army suffered 55,000 casualties, more than Lee's entire army. Northern newspapers called Grant the Butcher, and there was growing opposition to the war in the North. But Grant pressed on, understanding that he could replace his losses, while Lee could not. The campaign reached its climax at Cold Harbor, where Grant ordered a frontal assault against entrenched Confederate positions. The attack was a disaster. Union forces suffered 7,000 casualties in less than an hour, many of them in the first few minutes. Grant later wrote that he regretted the assault more than any other decision in the war, but even the disaster at Cold Harbor served Grant's larger strategy. Lee's army was being worn down by constant fighting, and Confederate morale was cracking. As one Confederate soldier wrote, "We are whipped, but we won't give up." While Grant and Lee fought their deadly dance in Virginia, Sherman was advancing on Atlanta. Sherman's army of 100,000 men faced Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston, who conducted a masterful fighting retreat through northern Georgia. Johnston's strategy was to make Sherman pay for every mile while preserving his army for a decisive battle. But Jefferson Davis lost patience with Johnston's defensive strategy and replaced him with General John Bell Hood, an aggressive fighter who immediately went on the offensive. Hood's attacks were brave but futile. Sherman's forces were too strong and too well positioned. By September 1864, Atlanta had fallen, giving Lincoln a crucial victory just 2 months before the presidential election. The fall of Atlanta was a devastating blow to Confederate morale. Atlanta was a major manufacturing center and transportation hub, and its loss severely damaged the Confederate war effort. More importantly, the victory gave the Union a much-needed boost at a critical moment. Sherman's capture of Atlanta set the stage for his most controversial decision, the March to the Sea. Abandoning his supply lines, Sherman set out across Georgia with 60,000 men, living off the land and destroying everything of military value. The march was a demonstration of Union power and Confederate weakness. The March to the Sea was warfare of a new kind. Sherman's forces destroyed railroads, burned mills, and confiscated livestock. They cut a swath of destruction 60 miles wide and 300 miles long from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman's goal was not just military victory but psychological defeat, to show the South that their government could not protect them. The march was controversial then and remains so today. Sherman's men destroyed an estimated $100 million worth of property, though they generally avoided harming civilians directly. As Sherman explained his philosophy, war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. He believed that making war terrible for Southern civilians would hasten the conflict's end and ultimately save lives. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 21, 1864, and Sherman famously telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton." The march had been a complete success, demonstrating Union power and Confederate helplessness. Meanwhile, other Union forces were tightening the noose around the Confederacy. In the Shenandoah Valley, General Philip Sheridan was conducting his own campaign of destruction, burning barns and mills to deny resources to Lee's army. Admiral David Farragut had captured Mobile Bay in August 1864, further tightening the naval blockade. The political dimension of the war was equally important. The 1864 presidential election was crucial for Union war aims. Lincoln faced a strong challenge from General George McClellan, running on a platform that called the war a failure and advocated negotiated peace. For a time, Lincoln believed he would lose the election. The fall of Atlanta changed everything. Northern morale soared, and Lincoln won re-election decisively, carrying all but 3 states. The election results sent a clear message. The North was committed to fighting until the Confederacy was completely defeated. By early 1865, Confederate resistance was crumbling. Lee's army was trapped in the trenches around Petersburg, slowly starving as Union forces tightened their grip. Sherman had turned north from Savannah, advancing through South Carolina with the same destructive efficiency he had shown in Georgia. The Confederate government was barely functioning, and Southern morale was collapsing. The end came quickly. On April 2, 1865, Lee's lines at Petersburg finally broke under Union pressure. The Confederate government fled Richmond, and Union forces occupied the Confederate capital the next day. Lee's army retreated westward, hoping to escape and continue the fight, but they were surrounded near a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee rode to meet Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox. The two generals, who had fought each other so fiercely for almost a year, were courteous and respectful. Lee wore his finest uniform and carried an ornate sword. Grant wore a simple private's blouse with general's stars pinned to the shoulders. The surrender terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home, taking their personal property with them. Officers could keep their sidearms, and men who owned horses could take them for spring ploughing. Most importantly, there would be no treason trials or executions. Grant's magnanimity set the tone for what Lincoln hoped would be a healing peace. As Lee left the McLean House, he faced his army for the last time. The Confederate soldiers began to cheer, but Lee silenced them with a gesture. His farewell order to his troops was gracious in defeat. After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. The surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War, though some Confederate forces continued to fight for several more weeks. The statistics were staggering. Over 620,000 Americans had died in the conflict, more than in all other American wars combined until Vietnam. The equivalent percentage of today's population would be about 6 million deaths. But the war's end was overshadowed by tragedy. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theatre in Washington. Lincoln's death deprived the nation of the leader, who might have guided the difficult process of Reconstruction with wisdom and compassion. The grinding years of 1864 to 1865 had achieved their purpose. The Confederacy was not just defeated but destroyed. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, and the United States emerged from the war as a modern industrial nation. But the cost had been enormous, and the scars would take generations to heal. Chapter 8, The Home Front Wars. While armies clashed on distant battlefields, the Civil War was transforming American society in ways that would prove as lasting as any military victory. The conflict reached into every home, every community, and every aspect of daily life, creating parallel wars on the home front that were just as crucial to the final outcome as the battles fought by soldiers. In the North, the war accelerated trends that were already reshaping American society. The demands of wartime production turned the United States into a modern industrial nation almost overnight. Factories that had made textiles before the war now produced uniforms, tents and blankets. Ironworks that had crafted ploughs and tools began manufacturing cannons and rifles. The Remington Arms Company, which had employed 200 people before the war, had 2,000 workers by 1864. This industrial transformation created new opportunities for workers, but it also brought new challenges. With millions of men away fighting, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They worked in ammunition factories, sewed uniforms, and took over traditionally male jobs in banks and government offices. The war began to break down some of the rigid gender roles that had defined American society. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, exemplified the new roles women were assuming. She organized supplies for Union armies, nursed wounded soldiers, and even went to battlefields to distribute aid. When asked why she did such dangerous work, she replied, "I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it, and while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." The war also transformed northern agriculture. With so many men in the army, farmers turned to new machinery to maintain production. The McCormick reaper, which had been invented before the war, became essential for harvesting grain. By 1864, the North was producing more food than ever before, despite having millions of men in military service. But the war's demands also created problems. Inflation soared as the government printed money to finance the conflict. The cost of living doubled during the war, creating hardship for working families. In New York City, anger over the draft and economic hardship exploded into the draft riots of July 1863, the largest civil insurrection in American history outside of the Civil War itself. The draft riots revealed the tensions that the war had created in Northern society. The draft law allowed wealthy men to avoid service by paying $300 or hiring a substitute, leading to the bitter complaint that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The riots, which lasted 4 days, targeted African Americans, whom many Irish immigrants blamed for the war and saw as economic competitors. The South faced even greater challenges on the home front. The Union blockade gradually strangled the Confederate economy, creating shortages of everything from coffee to shoes. Southern women had to become self-sufficient in ways their grandmothers would have recognized, but that seemed impossible in 1860. They learned to make soap from ashes, to card and spin cotton into thread, and to preserve food without salt. The diary of Mary Chesnut, the wife of a Confederate official, captured the gradual deterioration of Southern life. In 1861, she wrote of elegant parties and confident talk of quick victory. By 1864, She was writing about friends who had lost sons, shortages of basic necessities, and growing despair about the war's outcome. Southern women also had to deal with the challenge of managing enslaved people while their husbands were away fighting. Many slaveholders feared that their absence would lead to slave rebellions, but large-scale revolts never materialized. Instead, slavery gradually crumbled as enslaved people ran away to Union lines or simply refused to work. The experience of enslaved people during the war was complex and varied. Some remained loyal to their masters, either from genuine affection or because they had no other choice. But many others saw the war as an opportunity for freedom. Whenever Union armies approached, enslaved people fled to Union lines, often bringing valuable information about Confederate troop movements. These fugitive slaves, whom Union forces called contrabands, posed a challenge for Union commanders. Early in the war, some Union officers returned escaped slaves to their masters, but this policy became increasingly unpopular. Eventually, Union armies began using former slaves as laborers, guides, and soldiers. The transformation of the war's purpose from preserving the Union to ending slavery created new dynamics on the home front. Northern abolitionists, who had been a small minority before the war, suddenly found themselves in the mainstream. Frederick Douglass, who had spent decades fighting for abolition, became one of the war's most influential voices. But the war also revealed the limits of Northern commitment to racial equality. Even as they fought to end slavery, many Northern whites remained deeply prejudiced against African Americans. The use of black soldiers was controversial, and black troops faced discrimination even within the Union Army. They were paid less than white soldiers and often given inferior equipment. The war's impact on children was particularly profound. In both North and South, children grew up in a world dominated by war. They played war games, collected pictures of generals, and learned geography from battlefield maps. Many children lost fathers, brothers, and uncles to the conflict. Education was disrupted throughout the South as schools closed and teachers joined the army. In the North, the war actually led to improvements in education as the need for skilled workers increased. The Morrill Act of 1862 established the land-grant college system, creating universities that would educate generations of Americans. The war also accelerated changes in American religion. Churches split along sectional lines, with Northern and Southern Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians forming separate organizations. The war was seen by many as a divine test of American righteousness, with both sides claiming God's favor. The technological changes brought by the war were equally dramatic. The telegraph allowed for rapid communication over long distances, making it possible to coordinate military operations across a continent. Photography brought the reality of war into American homes for the first time. Matthew Brady's photographs of battlefield dead shocked the Northern public and helped them understand the war's true cost. The war also transformed American medicine. Military hospitals became laboratories for medical innovation, and the massive number of wounded led to advances in surgery, nursing, and hospital organization. The United States Sanitary Commission, a civilian organization that supported Union medical efforts, pioneered many techniques that would later be used in civilian medicine. By 1865, the home front wars had transformed American society as thoroughly as the military campaigns had transformed the political landscape. The United States emerged from the conflict as a modern industrial nation with a stronger federal government and a more complex social structure. The war had accelerated trends that might have taken decades to develop in peacetime, creating the foundation for America's emergence as a world power. Chapter 9. The Weight of Leadership. The Civil War tested American leadership in ways that no previous crisis had done. Presidents, generals, governors, and ordinary citizens found themselves making decisions that would affect millions of lives and determine the nation's future. The quality of leadership on both sides, its successes and failures, would prove as important as any battle in determining the war's outcome. Abraham Lincoln entered the presidency as an untested prairie lawyer with no executive experience and a reputation based largely on his debates with Stephen Douglas. Few expected him to become one of America's greatest presidents, but the war revealed depths of character and political skill that even his supporters hadn't suspected. Lincoln's greatest strength was his ability to grow in the job. Early in the war, he made mistakes, interfering with military operations, misjudging public opinion, and sometimes acting beyond his constitutional authority. But he learned from these errors and gradually developed into a masterful wartime leader who combined political pragmatism with moral vision. The The president's handling of the slavery question exemplified his political skill. Lincoln personally opposed slavery, but he understood that moving too quickly on emancipation might drive the border states into the Confederacy. He waited until the Union had achieved military success and Northern public opinion had evolved before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. As he explained to a critic, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." Lincoln's leadership style was remarkably hands-on. He spent hours in the War Department telegraph office, following military operations in real time. He visited battlefields, hospitals and military camps, boosting morale and gathering information. Soldiers loved him. They called him Father Abraham and cheered wildly when he appeared. But Lincoln also showed remarkable political courage. He suspended habeas corpus, imposed martial law in some areas, and authorized the arrest of suspected Confederate sympathizers. These actions were controversial and probably unconstitutional, but Lincoln believed they were necessary to preserve the Union. As he put it, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated?" The president's relationship with his generals was complex and often frustrating. Lincoln went through a series of commanders in the Eastern Theater, each one promising to end the war quickly and each one failing to deliver. He fired generals who were too cautious McClellan, too reckless Hooker, or too incompetent Burnside. Not until he found Grant did he have a general who shared his understanding of what the war required. Lincoln's cabinet was a team of rivals, strong personalities who often disagreed with each other and sometimes with the president. Secretary of State William Seward initially saw himself as the real power behind the throne, but Lincoln quickly established his authority. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was efficient but abrasive, often clashing with generals and politicians. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase harbored presidential ambitions and sometimes worked against Lincoln's policies. Despite these tensions, Lincoln managed his cabinet skillfully, using their disagreements to test his own ideas while maintaining final authority. He was particularly skilled at timing, knowing when to push forward and when to wait. Second inaugural address, delivered just 6 weeks before his assassination, showed how much he had grown as a leader, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. As God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Confederate leadership faced different challenges. Jefferson Davis was in many ways better qualified for the presidency than Lincoln. He was a West Point graduate, a Mexican War veteran, and a former Secretary of War. But he proved less effective as a wartime leader, partly because of his personality and partly because of the inherent weaknesses of the Confederate system. Davis was intelligent, dedicated, and honest, but he was also rigid, prideful, and unable to delegate authority. He interfered constantly in military operations, often overruling his generals on tactical matters. He feuded with Confederate politicians and generals, creating divisions that weakened the Confederate cause. The Confederate Constitution, which emphasized states' rights, made effective leadership more difficult. Governors like Joseph E. Brown of Georgia and Zebulon Vance of North Carolina often refused to cooperate with Confederate policies, claiming that state sovereignty took precedence over Confederate authority. This created a paradox. The Confederacy was fighting for states' rights, but states' rights made it difficult to fight effectively. Robert E. Lee emerged as the Confederacy's most effective leader, though he was a general rather than a politician. Lee combined tactical brilliance with personal integrity and the ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his troops. His soldiers would follow him anywhere, and his reputation for invincibility sustained Confederate morale even in defeat. But Lee also had limitations as a strategic leader. He was focused primarily on Virginia and the Eastern Theater, sometimes at the expense of the Confederacy's broader strategic needs. His aggressive tactics, while often successful, cost the Confederacy casualties it could not afford. By 1864, his army was being worn down by constant fighting, and he lacked the resources to replace his losses. The Union's development of effective military leadership was crucial to its victory. Early in the war, Lincoln struggled to find generals who could match Confederate commanders like Lee and Jackson. The Union's initial commanders were often products of the old army, trained in the conventional warfare of an earlier era. Grant's emergence as the Union's premier general was partly due to his understanding of the war's true nature. Unlike commanders who focused on capturing territory, Grant understood that the war could only be won by destroying Confederate armies. He was willing to accept heavy casualties to achieve this goal, earning him the nickname the Butcher, but also bringing the war to a successful conclusion. Grant's partnership with Sherman was particularly effective. The two generals understood each other perfectly and coordinated their operations to maximum effect. Sherman's march to the sea was conducted with Grant's full support and was designed to complement Grant's operations in Virginia. Military leadership at lower levels was equally important. The Civil War was the first conflict in which company and regimental commanders had to manage large numbers of men in complex operations. Many of these officers were volunteers with no military training, and they had to learn their jobs through trial and error. The war also revealed the importance of staff work and military administration. Armies of 100,000 men required complex supply systems, medical services, and communication networks. The Union's superior ability to organize and sustain large forces was a crucial advantage. Leadership on the home front was equally important. Governors like Andrew of Massachusetts and Morton of Indiana played crucial roles in mobilizing their states for war. They organized regiments, coordinated with federal authorities, and maintained public support for the war effort. Women also emerged as important leaders during the war. Dorothea Dix reorganized Union medical services. Clara Barton founded what would become the American Red Cross, and countless other women organized relief efforts and supported the war effort in their communities. The war's demands created new forms of leadership and revealed leadership potential in unexpected places. Ordinary citizens found themselves organizing volunteer units, managing hospitals, and coordinating relief efforts. The war democratized leadership in ways that would have lasting effects on American society. By 1865, the weight of leadership had transformed both the leaders and the nation they led. Lincoln had grown from a prairie lawyer into a statesman of world stature. Grant had evolved from a failed businessman into one of America's greatest generals. The war had tested American leadership, and despite many failures and setbacks, had ultimately produced the quality of leadership necessary for victory. Chapter 10, The Human Cost. Behind every statistic of the Civil War stood individual human stories of courage and cowardice, of sacrifice and suffering, of families torn apart and communities destroyed. The war's human cost extended far beyond the battlefield casualties, encompassing the profound ways that 4 years of conflict changed the lives of ordinary Americans. The numbers themselves are staggering. Approximately 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War, though recent scholarship suggests the total may have been as high as 750,000. To put this in perspective, the Civil War killed more Americans than World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. In a nation of 31 million people, this represented about 2% of the entire population, equivalent to 6 million deaths today. But statistics cannot capture the individual tragedies that made up this larger catastrophe. Consider the story of Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. She was baking bread for Union soldiers when a Confederate bullet passed through 2 doors and struck her in the back. She was 20 years old and engaged to be married. Her death symbolized how the war reached into every corner of American life. The experience of combat was unlike anything Americans had previously encountered. The rifled musket, the war's primary weapon, was accurate at ranges up to 500 yards, but military tactics had not adapted to this new technology. Generals still ordered frontal assaults against entrenched positions with predictably horrific results. Private Sam Watkins of the One Stone Tennessee Infantry Regiment described the Battle of Franklin in 1864. "I had heard and read of battlefields, had seen men die, but I had never witnessed anything like this. The dead were piled in heaps, and the wounded were lying in every conceivable position. I could not look at it without weeping. The medical care available to wounded soldiers was primitive by modern standards. Battlefield surgery was often performed without anesthesia, and antiseptic techniques were unknown. The mortality rate from wounds was about 14%, but disease killed far more soldiers than bullets did. For every soldier who died in battle, 2 died from disease. Hospitals were overwhelmed and understaffed. Walt Whitman, who volunteered as a nurse in Washington hospitals, wrote movingly about the young men he tended. "The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing. Hand, I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad." The war's impact on families was devastating. An estimated 200,000 children lost fathers in the war, and countless more lost brothers, uncles, and cousins. The Sullivan family of New Hampshire sent 5 sons to war, only 1 returned. The story was repeated in thousands of households across the nation. Women bore a particularly heavy burden during the war. In addition to managing households and farms while their men were away, many women entered the workforce for the first time. They worked in factories, served as nurses, and took over traditionally male roles in offices and shops. The war began to break down some of the rigid gender roles that had defined American society. Southern women faced additional challenges. The Union blockade created shortages of basic necessities, and women had to become self-sufficient in ways their grandmothers would have recognized, but that seemed impossible in 1860. They learned to make soap from ashes, to card and spin cotton into thread, and to preserve food without salt. The Diary of Sarah Morgan, a young Louisiana woman, captured the gradual deterioration of Southern life. If we had been told 2 years ago that we would be living on cornbread and sweet potatoes, sleeping in our clothes and afraid to go to bed, we would have laughed at the idea. Now it seems natural. The war also had a profound impact on children. In both North and South, children grew up in a world dominated by war. They played war games, collected pictures of generals, and learned geography from battlefield maps. Many children lost fathers, brothers, and uncles to the conflict. 8-year-old Lucy Rebecca Buck kept a diary during the war from her home in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Her entries reflect both the innocence of childhood and the harsh realities of war. The Yankees came through today and took our horses. Papa says we must be brave, but I don't understand why they want to hurt us. The experience of enslaved people during the war was complex and varied. Some remained loyal to their masters, either from genuine affection or because they had no other choice. But many others saw the war as an opportunity for freedom. Whenever Union armies approached, enslaved people fled to Union lines, often bringing valuable information about Confederate troop movements. The transition from slavery to freedom was often difficult and dangerous. Former slaves faced discrimination, economic hardship, and sometimes violence. But for many, the war represented the fulfillment of long-held dreams of freedom. As one freed slave in Georgia wrote, "I felt like a bird let out of a cage." I could hardly believe it was true. The war's psychological impact was also profound. Many soldiers suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, flashbacks, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The term soldier's heart was used to describe the psychological effects of combat, but little was understood about how to treat these conditions. The war created a generation of veterans who would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Amputees were a common sight in American towns for decades after the war. The Grand Army of the Republic, a Union veterans organization, became a powerful political force that shaped American politics well into the 20th century. The economic impact of the war was equally significant. The North's economy was stimulated by wartime production, but the South's economy was devastated. The destruction of railroads, factories, and farms, combined with the end of slavery, left the South impoverished for generations. The war also had cultural and social effects that would last long after guns fell silent. The shared experience of combat created bonds between soldiers that transcended class and regional differences. The war helped create a more unified American culture, though regional differences remained strong. The development of photography during the war brought the reality of combat into American homes for the first time. Matthew Brady's photographs of battlefield dead shocked the Northern public and helped them understand the war's true cost. For the first time, Americans could see what war actually looked like. The war also accelerated changes in American religion. Many people struggled to reconcile their faith with the carnage they witnessed. Some lost their faith entirely, while others found comfort in religious belief. The war led to the growth of new religious movements and the decline of others. The human cost of the Civil War extended far beyond the 4 years of active fighting. The war's effects on American society, culture, and individual lives would last for generations. Families would mourn their dead for decades, communities would struggle to rebuild, and the nation would grapple with the war's legacy for more than a century. The Civil War was not just a political or military conflict, it was a human tragedy of unprecedented scale. Understanding this human dimension is essential to understanding the war's true significance and its lasting impact on American society. The war touched every American life directly or indirectly, and its effects continue to shape American society today. Chapter 11: The War's End and Lincoln's Vision. As the spring of 1865 unfolded, the Confederacy was collapsing like a house of cards. Lee's army was trapped at Petersburg, Sherman was marching through the Carolinas, and Confederate resistance was crumbling across the South. But even as military victory seemed assured, the question of what would come next loomed large. How would the Union be restored? How would 4 million freed slaves be integrated into American society? How would the nation heal from its deepest wounds? Abraham Lincoln had been thinking about these questions for months. Unlike some of his Republican colleagues who wanted to punish the South harshly, Lincoln believed that magnanimity in victory would be essential for lasting peace. His vision for Reconstruction was based on the principle that the Union had never been legally broken. The Confederate States had been in rebellion, but they had never actually left the Union. Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction was outlined in his 10% plan, announced in December 1863. Under this plan, a Confederate state could be readmitted to the Union when 10% of its 1860 voters took a loyalty oath and the state adopted a new constitution abolishing slavery. This was a relatively lenient policy designed to encourage Confederate surrender and speed the restoration of the Union. But Lincoln's plan faced opposition from radical Republicans in Congress who believed it was too lenient. Led by men like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, the radicals wanted to punish the South more harshly and ensure that freed slaves received full political rights. They passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which required 50% of voters to take a loyalty oath and imposed harsher conditions on readmission. Lincoln pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis Bill, setting up a conflict between the executive and legislative branches that would have profound consequences after his death. The president believed that harsh punishment would only prolong sectional hatred and make reunion more difficult. As he said in his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all, the nation should bind up the nation's wounds. The end came more quickly than anyone expected. On April 2, 1865, Lee's lines at Petersburg finally broke under relentless Union pressure. The Confederate government fled Richmond and Union forces occupied the Confederate capital the next day. Richmond's fall was a powerful symbol. The city had been the Confederate capital for 4 years, and its capture marked the effective end of the Confederacy. Lee's army retreated westward, hoping to escape Grant's pursuit and continue the fight. But the Army of Northern Virginia was exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. Many soldiers were deserting, and those who remained were barely able to march. At Sailor's Creek on April 6, Union forces captured about 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including several generals. The end came at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Lee's army, reduced to about 28,000 men, was surrounded by Grant's forces. Lee realized that further resistance would only result in useless bloodshed. As he told his staff, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The surrender meeting between Lee and Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlor was conducted with dignity and mutual respect. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home, taking their personal property with them. Officers could keep their sidearms, and men who owned horses could take them for spring ploughing. Most importantly, there would be no treason trials or executions. Lee's acceptance of these terms was crucial for the peace that followed. The Confederate general's dignity in defeat and his acceptance of the war's outcome helped prevent the guerrilla warfare that might have continued for years. His farewell order to his troops set the tone for Confederate acceptance of defeat. After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. The surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War, though some Confederate forces continued to fight for several more weeks. Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia on May 10th, and the last Confederate army surrendered on May 26. The war was over, but the challenge of peace was just beginning. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was beginning to take shape in his final days. On April 11, 1865, he gave his last major speech, addressing a crowd gathered on the White House lawn to celebrate the Union victory. The speech revealed his evolving thoughts about Reconstruction and civil rights. For the first time in a major address, Lincoln publicly endorsed limited voting rights for African Americans. He suggested that the vote should be given to the very intelligent among the freed slaves and to those who had served in the Union Army. This was a significant step for a president who had once believed that blacks and whites could not live together as equals. Lincoln's speech also revealed his flexibility on Reconstruction policy. He acknowledged that different approaches might be needed for different states and that the process would require careful attention to local conditions. His pragmatic approach was designed to encourage cooperation rather than resistance from the defeated South. But Lincoln's vision would remain largely unrealized. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, the President attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theatre in Washington. During the third act, actor John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the head. Booth was a Confederate sympathizer who believed that killing Lincoln might somehow revive the Confederate cause. After shooting the president, he leaped to the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He then escaped on horseback, but he was tracked down and killed by Union troops 12 days later. Lincoln died the next morning, April 15, 1865, at 7:22 a.m. His death sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. In the North, millions of people lined the railroad tracks as Lincoln's funeral train carried his body back to Springfield, Illinois. Even in the defeated South, many recognized that Lincoln's death was a tragedy that would make Reconstruction more difficult. The assassination elevated Vice President Andrew Johnson to the presidency. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, and Lincoln had chosen him as his running mate in 1864 to promote national unity. But Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skills and his vision for reconciliation. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction was initially similar to Lincoln's. He wanted to restore the Union quickly and with minimal punishment for the South. But Johnson was rigid where Lincoln had been flexible, and he lacked the political skills to work with Congress. His conflicts with the radical Republicans would dominate the early years of Reconstruction. The question of what Lincoln might have accomplished had he lived remains one of history's great what-ifs. His political skills, his moral authority, and his vision of reconciliation might have produced a very different Reconstruction, but his death ensured that the peace would be as contentious as the war had been. Lincoln's legacy was already secure by the time of his death. He had preserved the Union, ended slavery, and demonstrated that democratic government could survive its greatest test. His vision of America as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal would continue to inspire future generations. The war's end in 1865 marked the beginning of a new chapter in American history. The Union had been preserved, but at an enormous cost. The challenges of Reconstruction, integrating freed slaves into American society, rebuilding the South and healing the nation's wounds, would prove as difficult as winning the war itself. As the guns fell silent and the soldiers began their long journey home, Americans faced an uncertain future. The war had settled the questions of Union and slavery, but it had raised new questions about the nature of American democracy and the rights of citizenship. The answers to these questions would shape American society for generations to come. Chapter 12: Legacy and Reflection. The Civil War ended in 1865, but its echoes continued to reverberate through American society more than 150 years later. The conflict that began as a dispute over the nature of the Union became a transformative event that reshaped American government, society, and culture in ways that are still being felt today. The most immediate and obvious legacy of the Civil War was the preservation of the Union. The war definitively settled the question of whether states could leave the Union. They could not. The victory of federal authority over state sovereignty fundamentally changed the nature of American government, creating a stronger national government that would play an increasingly important role in American life. The war also ended slavery, fulfilling the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. This was followed by the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. But the end of slavery did not mean the end of racial inequality. The period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, saw significant progress in civil rights, with African Americans voting, holding office, and participating in American democracy. But this progress was largely reversed after federal troops were withdrawn from the South in 1877, beginning a long period of segregation and disenfranchisement that would last until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The war's impact on American society was profound and lasting. The conflict accelerated the transformation of the United States from an agricultural to an industrial nation. The demands of wartime production stimulated technological innovation and industrial growth, laying the foundation for America's emergence as a world power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The war also changed American culture and values. The shared sacrifice of wartime created a stronger sense of national identity, though regional differences remained strong. The war gave Americans a common set of heroes and symbols: Lincoln, Grant, Lee, and the soldiers who fought and died for their beliefs.